Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris, and I'm joined by Eric Rush and Robert Koshu. Everyone want to say hi to the good people?
Hi to the good people.
That's okay. I'm filing a grievance. I'm sorry. That's just unacceptable.
No. Hey, if you can do it, Chris, anybody can do it.
Okay. Yeah. That's certainly what I hear every day when I show up at work. So trying to get back into the swing of this. Eric actually came up with the idea for this. So do you want to kind of give the setup for today's fork or today's episode?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I'd love to. And this is interesting because we at a Fork in Time, we borrow from other podcasts and other media that we listen to, and so we had I had an interesting idea that I got from a different podcast, which was basically, what if the Soviet Union wasn't dissolved in December of 1991? And keeping in mind that, as we say all the time on A Fork in Time, is events in history happen because of very specific circumstances, and that is definitely true for the conclusion of the Cold War. And so I think all of us on the call were at various stages in our lives during the end of the Cold War, and saw this from 1989 to 1991, saw the events unfold. And one of the events that unfolded was the disintegration of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, and the ascendance of all of the successor states, including what we now know as the Russian Federation. What I don't think some people understand is that part of the reason why events unfolded as they did occurred because of some discussions and some decisions that were made on our terms here in the United States. So keeping in mind that over the course of President Bush's, this is President Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, who was president from 1989 to 1993. So he really was the president over the course of the conclusion of the Cold War. And so he and his administration had a lot of decisions to make regarding the end of the Cold War, the disintegration of first the Warsaw Pact, and then subsequently the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And there were a couple of camps within the Bush administration in terms of foreign policy that I think people should be aware of. The first is and again, these are my characterizations. There are people who have a lot more knowledge of political science and foreign policy than I do, but what I would call the kind of the moderate internationalist wing, of whom President Bush was one of them. And these would include people like Secretary of State James Baker. These would include I think he was National Security Advisor, Brett Scowcroft. Is that correct? As he was
correct.
National Security Advisor. And they were very much on the internationalist side. And what my perception is they craved stability more than anything. And in the interest of stability, they would have found the persistence of the Soviet Union as a political entity to be acceptable under certain circumstances, because they wanted stability. But then you had another wing, and these were people like Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney. And I can't remember Paul Wolfowitz's role within the Bush administration, but Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense at that point. And they were very much in what we would have eventually called the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party. And they were very much in a sort of a let it die framework to say, the world would be better off if the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, and that we as the U.S. as the world's lone superpower would deal with those ramifications.
If I could, I think this is one interesting policy departure between the Reagan and the Bush administrations. I think the Reagan administration very much was listening to those early neocon voices and openly confronting and attacking the Soviet Union.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Wolfowitz was Undersecretary of State.
Undersecretary of State. Okay. Thank you, Rob. Yeah.
Defense. My apologies. Misspoke. Undersecretary of Defense.
Yeah, so we had some very clear camps, and I agree with you, Chris. I agree completely that it was very much more of those voices being louder in the Reagan administration than the Bush administration, which I think the Bush administration was a more moderate and a more cautious administration than the Reagan administration. And I would also argue that was very much a positive that befit the time. We were talking about this. We were talking about this off podcast. Is that we're not a political podcast, and so we try to report neutrally. But I will say that I tend to view Bush 41, George H.W. Bush's presidency very positively. Because I certainly view him as a very stable and steady hand during a very important time of transition where we if we hadn't had that, it could have turned out much differently. And so I think we have those sorts of things in mind when we're kind of proceeding with the rest of the discussion. But so you had two camps within the Bush administration while things were proceeding in the Soviet Union. And then in August of 1991, what happened? Chris?
The hardline Soviets basically stage a coup against Gorbachev. Gorbachev gets under house arrest, and there are 5 days, as I recall, where the world is freaking out. And I'm going to say literally, as someone who grew up in my formative high school years were 1979 to 1983.
Mm-hmm.
And so heat, heart, dead center, some of the worst parts of the Cold War, KAL 007, the Day After movie is released. And so one of the biggest things that everyone wanted to know at that moment, and there were parts of the administration that could not confirm who had control of the nuclear codes. And that really goes into why there's a segment of the Bush policy team that says, don't care if the Soviets are around, because guess what? If the Soviets are around, we know who is controlling their thousands of nuclear weapons. And that was of paramount importance to the George H.W. Bush's team. Who's controlling who's got the codes? Who can launch a nuclear missile, no matter the destination?
Yeah.
Because a nuke launch from a rogue state or from any area can be made to look like it's coming from a NATO country.
Well, I mean, and
which instantly triggers response.
And I think we can argue that a nuclear weapon launch from anywhere to anywhere is a bad thing.
Oh, it's a bad thing.
It's a bad thing. And so foreign policy that is designed to ensure stability of nuclear weapons is good foreign policy and remains good foreign policy. So
follow it a little bit further. Gorbachev has the most disastrous vacation probably since, I'm sure Chevy Chase made one of those movies. Why didn't he make one? This would be an amazing
vacation movie.
National Lampoon's Crimean Vacation.
Soviet Vacation. I would watch that movie.
Right. So basically he's out of the center of power. Some military / Siloviki KGB types say, we are now in charge. What happens after that?
So at that point, basically the people take to the streets of Moscow. Boris Yeltsin really rises to prominence because he really leads it at that point. The Soviet army is given the order, run in there with tanks. The Chinese took care of this. Y'all go do it the same way. This is 2 years after Tiananmen Square. And in essence, the Soviet soldiers look at their generals and leaders and say, nope, not doing it. And so the coup collapses of its own weight at that point.
Right.
Along with the U.S. starts feeding intelligence to Yeltsin as a part of it, because like you said, Chris, any policy that says if we know where the nukes are under control is a good policy.
And I think this was a play on the part of the United States to say Yeltsin's the up and comer.
Yep.
There's a very famous scene, I want to say in September at some meeting, where Yeltsin walks up to the podium and basically takes over running the meeting from Gorbachev. That's and that. And we were talking earlier, and we did have a discussion, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, this got me in some trouble, and I'm going to hope to reach out to the person I was talking to. Ukraine declared independence in August 91. The Baltic republics had already been declaring independence throughout 91. The Soviet Union doesn't end until the last day of 1991. It's when the flag comes down from the Kremlin and the new flag is raised. So a lot of things are happening very quickly, but basically the August coup, we think, is the death knell of the Soviet Union. It critically weakens Gorbachev.
I was going to say it
brings Yeltsin. It brings Yeltsin to power, to prominence, and Yeltsin's goal is a liberal democracy, but of a I'm not even going to say much smaller, but of a smaller political entity that is Russian,
right?
As opposed to the greater Soviet Union. We're all in agreement there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So what happens? What is our fork? What changes in this chain of events for us?
Well, I think because we know that what crippled Gorbachev fatally, at least politically, was the coup. So if we could prevent the coup from happening, knowing that in the U.S., so our foreign policy goals include nuclear stability, which again, that's a great goal. I think we had kind of secondary goals of promoting liberal democracy, and yes, that's a goal for the U.S., but that's always a secondary goal over both stability and our own preeminence.
And economic trade liberalization as well, not just
economic trade liberalization. Yep, exactly. And so I think those are our priorities. And so if we can achieve those goals with Gorbachev that we already knew, we would. But
especially with because we know him, because this was a nightmare scenario for so many people. Of a breakup of the Soviet Union. That's nightmare scenario now when you have when you have the proliferation of nuclear weapons into other states. Pakistan comes to mind. It doesn't exactly have a very good track record of handover of power. So when you have political transitions in places that have nuclear weapons, and a lot of them, if they get lost or things happen, that's a bad thing.
That's a bad
destabilizing political change.
Yes, absolutely.
So basically, the goal of the United States is, to accomplish political economic liberalization, because, by the way, we, looking at the Soviet Union of this time, think, and it's a generally accepted consensus, that's what's necessary to maintain this political entity. It cannot go on as it is. We talked a little bit about China right now. China is right now beginning its economic reforms because it realized the old economic system can't really sustain itself.
True. That's true. Well, and I would argue that they'd been slowly happening over the 80s with Deng Xiaoping.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So what is the actual nuts and bolts of how we change the coup?
Well, I think there are two things, and I think Robert, you had some thoughts on.
I had one
of the parts of this, and then I'll fill in the gaps on the other part.
Okay. So one thing that happened, and it's kind of a little known piece, that General Chi Haotians, who was a high general in the Greater Chinese People's Liberation Army, he visited Dmitry Yazov, who was one of the leaders of the coup. So, and this was right before the coup happens. He goes in to visit him, and there is much thoughts that China had some foreknowledge that this was fixing to go down. And by the way, China was cheering it on. And probably some of the advice he gave them, especially based on what we saw the initial Soviet military response to the coup being, was, dude, it's not a problem. If your people revolt and they give you a hard time, look what we did with Tiananmen Square. Remember, this is 2 years from Tiananmen Square, which is from a Chinese perspective, glorious victory. You know, the rest of the world remembers the guy standing in front of the tank. But from a Chinese perspective, it's a glorious victory because we stopped it. We stopped the revolution. And so, dude, all you got to do is follow along with that.
And the other thing I'm thinking about is Poland.
Yes.
In the early 80s also did something very similar where
and Lech Walesa goes under house arrest. Mm-hmm. Tanks roll in. Everything calms down.
So this was kind of an established playbook. They didn't have to dig deep to find this on the shelf of ideas.
No, they didn't.
So, and I think at that point, there are two things that happen here. A, because the KGB has it bugged. Because, you know, KGB bugs everybody. At that
especially
point, paranoia.
It's not just paranoia. When you have foreign military generals coming to talk to your own generals for the very reason of the conversation we're pretty sure is taking place right here. If there's any room that is bugged in the entire Soviet Union, it is going to be this one.
Yep.
True.
Yep. So they hear about it. So Gorbachev swoops in and shuts it down immediately.
Yep.
You know, at that point, it's like, nope, we're done.
And also, if there's any hint of this happening residually, or if there's any sort of hint of instability, then I would argue that under those circumstances, our intelligence could start feeding Gorbachev the same way we did Yeltsin, because we fed Yeltsin into intelligence, and you know that's part of the reason. You know, and you know, credit to Yeltsin, he did a lot of you know really interesting and brave things during that time, but he also did that with by being an intelligent consumer of our intelligence. Well, again, but you know, we gave Yeltsin that intelligence because we knew he was the up and comer, and we knew Gorbachev was politically dead. Mm-hmm. Well, and at that point, we thought he may be physically dead. You know, we didn't know. We had no idea at that point, and so we kind of had to pick our horse. And he seemed like the best bet to provide stability. And so what if that weren't the case? What if this was the kind of the hint of the coup that Gorbachev shuts down, but yet we're still concerned? You know, do we start feeding Gorbachev some intelligence? I think we could. I think we absolutely could. I think it's well known. I think that, you know, President Bush and Gorbachev had a good relationship. You know, Prime Minister Thatcher and Gorbachev had a good relationship. And so I think that it could be argued that, you know, some intelligence would have gotten his way and could have improved the stability at that point.
Oh yeah, I think that if the Five Eyes gets, and the Five Eyes is the U.S., United Kingdom, you know, basically the top NATO guys, Canada and Australia, if they get any inkling at all of this going on, they're going to call Gorbachev and say, because remember, point number one is, do above all else, what do we want to know?
Yep.
Where are the nukes? and who's controlling them. And in a coup scenario, there are multiple bad variables, for lack of a better term.
Yep. Agreed.
So Gorbachev steps in.
Mm-hmm.
He retires some people. He transfers some others. There's no August coup.
No August coup.
Now, I do not think that. I think the internationalist, the realist faction within H.W. Bush's administration was realistic enough to not spike the ball over Eastern Europe. They would not have publicized any of this support for Gorbachev.
Most of it didn't come out until most of what we know now came out years later.
Right.
Yeah.
It was not common knowledge at the time. There were a lot of behind the scenes talk.
So we've got an IOU. We know it. Gorbachev knows it. Nobody else knows it. The United States very much keeps this under wraps.
Mm-hmm.
But what do we do with this change in relationship? What do we try and what's the outcome we try and kind of steer things towards?
Soft landing. So recognition for entities that have declared sovereignty, and support for economic liberalization, trade liberalization, but political stability within the remnants of the Soviet Union, knowing that, especially the Central Asian republics had always been oriented towards Russia.
And it just struck me, the fact that there is a Chinese general in Moscow supporting, pushing for this coup. Who does that benefit? The United States and China have had kind of an open relationship now, but I think this is kind of a China realizing they're a relatively stable country, almost trying to push Russia into disorder.
Yeah.
With the eye to establishing their Belt and Road policy, which they're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there were two superpowers at that point, and China wasn't one of them.
And this is a good way to gain access to the resources to become one of them.
Right. Develop your own sphere of influence.
So you're saying, let's call it the CIS, because we have to call it something. CIS
something. And yeah, CIS. Yep, that's fine.
CIS is, even to this day, the Commonwealth of Independent States. It is the successor organization to the Soviet Union. It is the talking shop. In our timeline, it's a talking shop that somehow unites. I'd be interested to find out if Ukraine is still in it. Or Georgia, for that matter.
Ukraine is not in it.
Okay. What was it?
Ooh, that's a good question.
When did it leave? When did it? In Georgia as well, just because those are two nations that have been at war with Russia.
I think it was not ratified. I don't think Ukraine's ever been a full member of the CIS.
By Kuchma.
Maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think Ukraine has ever been a full member.
But CIS,
it still exists.
Oh yeah, because it's a loose confederation of former Soviet states. In this timeline, because the United States wants to deal with a single entity, you're saying the United States tries and transfer a lot of the power from the USSR to the CIS.
Yeah, whatever we call that entity, the U.S. transfers the power there, because again, we want stability, and whether the CIS, whether it is kind of nominally communist or not, I think is honestly less important to us. I think we would always prefer people to not be openly communist. That's that's kind of that's an American thing. But I think what's more important to us is that they are stable and not openly hostile.
And also not openly hostile to us,
but also
more importantly, yes, each other, because that very much becomes a really big deal when you have a nation breaking apart. You've got people that have basically lived in one province or another, and it hasn't mattered because it's just one province or another.
Right.
If tomorrow, Eric, Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas are in two different countries, that's going to matter, isn't it?
It's going to very much matter. Since I crossed that border multiple times a day, it's really going to matter.
And that's not just border controls. That's we talked about this off podcast. Maybe transferring military and political power to this successor entity stops some of the civil wars, some of the ethnic fighting we saw as part of the Soviet Union breaking up. And it happened. It did not happen on anything like the scale that we expected. It didn't even happen on the scale of what happened in Yugoslavia. When if you think about size of countries and complexity and numbers of people involved, Soviet Union falling was almost well run compared to Yugoslavia. But
Yugoslavia was the one country that worked better under communism than did anybody anywhere else under any other system. Oddly enough. Because it was such a segmented,
because of how communism came to Yugoslavia compared to how communism came to so many of these other countries. It was we're going to have an episode on Yugoslavia, I think.
I think we should have an episode on Yugoslavia. I think there's we haven't really tapped that because they were, they've largely been unaligned. So I think that makes them an interesting part of the communist sphere. I like it. I think we should do that.
But this is not that episode.
But and I think we would argue that this is probably only one part of two of this episode. Put a pin in that because we will come back to that in a little bit.
We do have a good idea. But I'm thinking about, and I warned myself previously that I would slaughter this, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a region within Armenia that is predominantly Azeri. That's led to 2 to 3 open wars between those countries. There's been a war between Russia and Georgia. There's been multiple wars in Chechnya. There's a war going on right now in Ukraine, largely over people wanting to live on one side of a border or another. This was an interesting point that I brought up earlier, and I love it, and I mention it all the time. Who drew the eastern border of Ukraine right now?
Well, it wasn't anybody in this time. It did not happen in 1989 or 1991 or anywhere even close.
It was pre-World War II even.
Yep. Chris, you want to? We're burying the lead a little bit, Chris.
Yeah, I know. I did. Well, to be fair, I was the one that sat there smiling while you guys guessed every Russian leader between Gorbachev and
Well, and that's actually a good aside. Is we talk off podcast for a little while before we start recording, and a lot of times what you're hearing is the collective wisdom of the group of us, and this is very much one of those times when what you're hearing is the collective wisdom of the group of us. And Robert and I had guessed probably, what do you think, Robert, like 6 times on who it was, and we were wrong.
I think we ran through every Russian leader from.
I think we did, but Chris had the right answer, which is Chris.
You left off Chernenko and Andropov.
Okay.
Did nothing with it.
We're always going to leave them off because they're irrelevant except for that they died.
Yeah. It wasn't even a Russian leader.
No, it was not.
And by the way, I'm not even going to die on the hill of it being these two people, but it was Ludendorff and Hindenburg. It was the Germans at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that intentionally drew the border of Ukraine to include the coal-rich Donbass region. That is today Donetsk and Luhansk.
Mm-hmm.
They were Russian regions, but they drew it into Ukraine specifically so that they could take over those rich economic areas when they took Ukraine away. As you guys figured, yeah, there was some political upheaval between 1918 and even let's say 34, when Stalin finally comes in and really sets things in stone. But the reason he didn't change it, and we're talking about just one area, but this was across the Soviet Union. The reason he didn't change it is because he wanted Russians in Ukraine. He wanted Russians in Estonia and in Latvia.
Mm-hmm.
If there weren't, guess what? He deported people and moved them around intentionally so that he would be able to create ethnically heterogeneous areas, specifically to make what happened in 1991 as messy as possible so that it wouldn't happen. And if you look at the history of Ukraine since independence, as long as there was a friendly government there that was okay with the Russian Federation, these regions had no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And
So,
and that was the Soviets played all of those off against each other for years. That's how the Soviets helped maintain control.
And like we said, the messiness of that kind of a divorce is a big reason for what we're talking about, which is a transition of the Soviet Union into some form of federation of independent states that are liberal democracies that can choose their own economic system.
Mm-hmm.
Central Asia is probably going to, I am going to go ahead and say I'm using air quotes here because everybody else can see me, but you good people at home can't, are going to quote unquote choose kleptocracy. I think that's going to happen to those places because that's what happened in this world. But I think your Baltics, maybe Ukraine, are going to liberalize and go down a road similar to the other transitional economies in Eastern Europe of the Czech Republic, of Poland. Those are the two real big success stories, but others, right?
But others, and I agree with that. And I think we might argue that the Baltics did that anyway. And so, it may make the time frame a little bit different, but probably the trajectory much the same. But it might have accelerated some things for the Ukraine.
And because here's the other important thing, and I think we all said this. What is the one thing that is going to stay? When we get to the federalist setup, you know what? We're talking about an interesting constitutional tie into that. Bet we've been on, but when you get into the federalist setting up the federalism of this new entity, of what is the responsibility of the overarching CIS, what's the one thing that has to have?
Russia. It has to have Russia.
What power?
It goes through.
It has to be the military.
Yeah.
Militarily, that is what the CIS does. Which means, in terms of NATO expansion, there's no way that the Baltics get in. But also, I think this is kind of what we talked about earlier. Edward Shevardnadze was a Georgian, but was he foreign minister?
He was foreign minister.
Yeah.
At this time.
And well known.
Yes. I'm not going to assume that everybody at home is that familiar with the last name etymology of Eastern Europe, but Shevardnadze is not a Russian, is he?
No, not at all.
Shevardnadze, no.
He's Georgian. And he, among others, would very much like to be a small fish in a big pond rather than having to go home and be prime minister, which he did, of a very, very small country.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an advantage for some of these countries to stay. The rub is the economic system. The rub is linguistics, being able to, conduct business in the language you speak. I think if the CIS, if this overarching organization gives them that leeway, they're fine staying in this grouping. And we talked about this. The United States, because this is in our interest, is probably okay with a little bit of stick.
Yeah. I mean, there are limits to what we're willing to accept.
Sure.
But I think if the stick is relatively light, and
it would be because there's so many carrots here.
Yeah.
Because you've got an openness, because you've got glasnost actually being carried through.
I think we would agree to this. I think, and I think we would agree with this because I think it meets our stated foreign policies, and I also think it gives the administration a 1992 win.
You think that this gives them a win in 92?
Yeah,
domestically, U.S. politically.
Yeah, I think potentially it could give U.S. a win in 92. Yeah,
interesting. Let's shift to that and talk about that for a little bit. I'm not sure, but I want to hear you out on what you say here.
Well, a couple things.
And, by the way, this was not discussed off podcast.
And I have another long-term consequence question. So we're going to bounce after this.
Yeah, we're going to freeform a little bit. And so it's 1991, and we have foreign policy success, and this is true in our timeline. But let's presume that we have an even more pronounced foreign policy success. Let's assume, for instance, that that we have, and I don't even know that the public cares so much about the persistence of the Soviet Union, because I didn't see it coming. Again, I was 12 when this happened, and so that that weighs into it. But I think what we wanted is we wanted to continue the Pax Americana, and I think you could argue that in some ways this it extends that even further. So we have greater stability, less international turmoil, and what was the nature of our recession in kind of 1990, 1991? What was the nature of that recession? Why did it happen?
91, 92.
Well, it would be more 1990. It was sort of post Gulf War.
Mm-hmm.
So why did it happen?
1990.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-Gulf War.
Yeah, 1990 went for 8 months. I was trying to remember that mild.
Because the invasion of Kuwait was August of 90.
Yeah, this is before that.
Okay, fine.
It's the end of the peacetime expansion. So basically, it kicks off because of, I'm trying to remember. It was a 90 price shock in oil. I'm looking very quickly.
So
just to see. Yeah,
I'll tell you what happened in 90 to the price of oil.
Yeah, what happened?
It plummeted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
No, but before it plummeted, I mean, and so and what did we do? What did the Federal Reserve do in response to that?
They started cutting rates. This was one of their first.
We had very restrictive monetary policy.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that a lot of those that you had the 1990 oil price shock, and then you had a fairly predictable response by the Federal Reserve. Now,
yeah,
the Federal Reserve in many cases, I think, creates recessions, and sometimes for good reasons. So you create recessions to avoid depressions, and I think that in some cases that's a trade-off. And so if we have a very different entanglement from the Cold War, would the 1990 price shock have happened necessarily? Why did it happen?
Wait a minute, though.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get our timeline straight. Our change happens August 91.
Okay.
You're
recession.
Talking about, yeah.
But there's context here.
Okay.
There's context here, and so and you could argue maybe I'm playing a little fast and loose, and but I would argue that if we are in the mindset of promoting a gradual liberalization, in the Soviet Union and in the rest of Eastern Europe, I think you could argue that maybe some of that 1990 oil price shock would have been mitigated to some extent, and some of the Fed policies wouldn't have even been required.
Well, the price shock occurs because Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait.
Well, that's true. That was the immediate event.
That was the immediate event that triggered it. The long-standing pieces of that price shock had to do some quick research because it had slipped. Savings and loan crisis. This is the back end of the RTC piece.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
If I can all of those are.
That's in there. That's a whole other conversation.
This may be one of the things we ask.
Well, maybe.
No, see, here's the thing. How had the Soviet Union been financing itself basically through the 80s? Grain sales and export of
oil.
Arms and oils. Yep.
Arms and oil. So this may be an actual instance where we actually call in some chits and get the CIS to open up the spigot.
There you go. That's my point.
Okay.
And so you have so you mitigate the oil shock in some degree. The Fed is not required to have as restrictive of policies,
or it can reverse them quicker. I do think because of the time we're talking about, they would have to put them in 90, but they can do something about them in 92 because of the new
Q4 91, Q1 92. You could reverse a lot of those. I agree, Chris. I think that's right.
Okay.
So let's say.
So here's another long term one. Then based on that, we'll freeform a little more. Since we've got the carrot, we get Russia to open the oil spigot, so we shorten the recession and the after effects of the recession. Bush is already Mr. Super Popular. The only reason Clinton wins is because read my lips, no new taxes, and there's a lingering recession. And yeah, you're right, Eric, what you said. It's the economy, stupid. There is no economy, stupid. So does Bush get a second term?
He does.
Because, by the way, when you initially were talking about the foreign, I have to say this, you've changed my mind. When you were talking about the initial foreign policy implications, I found it laughable that the average American voter would have cared about how the CIS happened, what happened there, compared to the outpouring of our troops came home and we finished the Vietnam syndrome. And if that wasn't big enough to do it, none of this kind of Kissinger-esque backroom diplomacy would have happened.
Right.
But it actually affected pocketbooks.
It affected pocketbooks.
And I think that is a real possibility to change. Yes.
So I think you have a very shallow and a very short what we'll call the 1990 to late 1991 recession on the back of some pretty significant foreign policy wins by Bush. And I think by November of 92, I think you have a healthy economy. I'm not even and so you have a healthy economy, and I would argue not only does that ensure Bush a second term, I don't think Perot even happens. Because I think Perot, and well, guys, we're getting in the weeds here. But if you're listening to Fork in Time at this point, you love the weeds. And so I think that the what resonates with Perot in 1992 it does not catch on, and so I think you have a pretty typical election between a Republican who is fairly popular, and I think you've got a Southern Democrat who is honestly kind of fighting for his political life, and I think in 92 in that instance, I think Bush wins in a cakewalk.
Or does Clinton? But I don't even think Clinton runs. I think Clinton has enough political savvy about him. Say what you will about Bill and Hillary Clinton, and I will throw them together. They are political chameleons with knowledge of politics that far exceeds most.
Okay,
I think Bill reads the tea leaves and says, "Nope, this is not my chance."
I distinctly remember a SNL skit in early '92 about the Democratic primaries, and the entire premise of it is a bunch of candidates on stage running to be the person beaten by George H.W. Bush.
Yep.
So here, I agree, and so I'm gonna back because I said Southern Democrat.
Okay.
The Democratic nominee in 1992 under this scenario is Paul Tsongas.
Okay,
I could buy that.
And I think he even knows that he's likely to lose, but I think I think Paul Tsongas. I think he was a decent guy. I think he was a decent guy who believed what he what he said, and I think he knew he was not likely to win. But he wanted the opportunity to speak his truth. And so he was willing to run anyway. And, by the way, Paul Tsongas died, what if he had won in 1992, what would have been the beginning of his second term in 1997. So, so that's that. I think it would be Bush, Tsongas. And I think if you had a Perot, then he would be an afterthought. He would be Gary Johnson getting 3%.
So I kind of want to finish it. I kind of want to wrap us up, just because we're at a point now that I'm about to ask you: does Gingrich happen? And what about the changes within the Democratic Party? The shift.
Gingrich doesn't happen. Because Gingrich, it's all. This is one of those where the fork yields many, many roads.
Do we have a shift from the Dukakis Democrats to kind of a Democratic leadership conference, the more centrist, because that shift happened because Clinton started winning? So do you still have a more traditional, what would probably be considered more progressive Democratic Party from the you don't have that blip?
You don't have the blip, and Gingrich never happens. Gingrich is a response to Bill Clinton.
And by the way,
the first term of Bill Clinton.
Do these neocons stay in the Republican Party? Do they find a home somewhere else?
So I think we don't know.
Okay.
I think what happens is, I agree with Robert. Gingrich never happens. He's a response to Clinton. I think what happens to the Democratic Party depends on 1996.
Okay.
Yep.
So you have you got a term limited Bush, and the Democrats learn.
Dan Quayle's a non-starter.
He's a non-starter, and it's been 16 years of Republican administration, and so it's going to be a Democrat. It's going to be Democrat. And so it just matters
to take it back to the last time we did this. It's going to be the Republican nominee will be their equivalent of Adlai Stevenson.
Right.
Just to pull it
Yep.
back to the last time we did one of these, where it turns
And
into
so
3 or 4 episodes.
you'll have fatigue, and it'll be the Democrat. And in 1996, the Democrat will be elected, and whoever is elected will be the litmus test for what happens in the 21st century, starting out.
So
If it is a Clinton type moderate, or whether it is a very progressive, how their success or failure in that role will point the direction for the rest of the Democratic Party for the next few years. Does
Gingrich not happen, or does Gingrich get shifted 4 years later?
Nah, he's done.
He's done.
He's done.
Yeah.
But
Gingrich does not become Gingrich.
No, he does not.
But is there any that kind of reaction?
Depends on what happens in 97. If the Democrats go progressive, or if the Democrats say we've got to be moderate at this point.
Okay.
We have to. So at that point, it's a progressive Democrat, a la Dukakis, or a moderate Democrat, Clinton.
Okay.
One of the two.
Yeah, I agree.
Not sure who the progressive would be, but Clinton might read the tea leaves at that point, provided he could stay "quote unquote" relevant and run. So you might end up with the Clinton 4 years later, but Gingrich never makes it that far.
I can see that. And I agree. I think,
and then Romney or Paul Ryan, maybe Paul Ryan becomes his foil.
No. I could see that. So we've got it all planned out. I mean, I think this is a very interesting and I think compelling timeline. And I will say this is very different. So so for those of you on that listen to A Fork in Time, there's a Discord server where everybody can submit messages and tell us your thoughts, but internally we talk via Slack, and this is where the team talks, and we have a lot of really robust discussion. The cool thing about our team is we've all got to be friends over this, which is honestly my favorite part of being part of this podcast. And so our friend and teammate Eric Bond had some really cool ideas that are totally different from what we had. And that, I think we should do a part 2, because I don't think we could do it justice without Eric being here, to talk about what
I liked Eric's, because man, Eric's takes us to a whole nother world.
Oh, it's a totally different world, which is one of the reasons why I thought it was so cool. So I read this and I was like, I can't do this I can't do this without Eric here. Like, he's got to be here. And so I think we should do a part 2. And so
when we say part 2, what we're talking about is a completely different fork. Because, by the way, let me remind us of this, guys. We started talking about the 91 August coup in the Soviet Union. And now we are talking about whether the Gingrich Revolution happened.
U.S. elections for the next 20 years.
By the way, I do find it there's some like level of justice in my mind of something happening elsewhere determining the U.S. election instead of us playing.
I agree.
Remember, U.S. elections, especially in that day and time, economy was always number one.
Yes.
Followed incredibly closely by foreign policy.
Yes.
Because what was the political ad in the Johnson campaign? Who do you want answering the telephone at 2 a.m. in the morning?
And by the way, I do think we didn't talk about this.
Goldwater, I can tell you that.
We didn't talk about this in the 92 election part of it, but the fact that there wasn't a Soviet Union probably helped Bill Clinton.
Oh, definitely.
That's interesting.
100%.
So let's just say again, we're talking about 11 months after.
Yeah.
So let's just say that, because we've all been through this, like the branding takes time, like the marketing people don't work fast. And so let's just say that in November of 92, it is still called the USSR.
Or it doesn't matter what it's called. There is still this entity that controls all of those nukes.
Yeah.
Controls all of that military power, basically represents all of that territory. and hasn't turned into a basket case.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure that it doesn't totally matter, Chris. Like, I agree with you on a lot of this. Like, it not being a basket case is important. Mm-hmm. But I remember distinctly in November of 1992, I was watching the election returns with my sister in her bedroom in 1992, and we were talking about like all of the like, what does this mean? Like, what is the Soviet Union? Like, and again, we were a couple of kids in Kansas, and we're talking about this. And so what it tells me is that, if we're talking about this in 1992, and this is important to us for the election returns, this is in the popular consciousness.
I also will say that the people who did the Willie Horton ad are going to do an equivalent of the Daisy ad if they can push it in any way.
Absolutely. Lee Atwater? Yeah, absolutely. Lee Atwater had vicious political instincts.
Yeah, I have very specific opinions on Lee Atwater.
Good, bad, or otherwise, he knew his politics and he knew how to win.
Yes, he did.
So yes, sometimes you separate out the good and the bad, but you realize no matter what, it's like
as
James Carville. Does James Carville take a prominent role?
As Eric was saying, he very much respects the coach of a team that can beat his team regularly because he respects the craft of that person.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. Well, I would like to wrap up, Chris, and I would like to wrap up with teasing.
Okay.
A little bit of our friend.
Before you do that, Eric.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
And I'm going to wrap up with, if anybody wonders why this was such a worrisome moment in history, I would recommend a movie called By Dawn's Early Light, where Soviet renegades launch a missile from just inside the Turkey border that the Soviet Union interpreted as a NATO attack.
Mm-hmm.
It was a movie released oddly enough in 1991.
Yeah.
And it is available on YouTube because that literally explains why this was such a worrisome moment in history. Thank you, Eric.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I hadn't heard of this movie, but I'm going to probably watch it in the next couple of days because I'm interested in this as well. Because that was a worry of a lot of us, and that was one of my worries during the coup is, who's in control, because I grew up in the 80s still being very worried about nuclear war. And so I think that's a really good message. So thank you, Robert, for that. I would tease part 2. So hopefully Chris and Robert and I will be back, and we will be joined by our other friend and teammate, Eric Bond, and hopefully other members of the Fork and Time podcast. Is a different fork. And so Eric had the idea, and this is prior to our fork, is the death of Konstantin Chernenko. There was an acting chairman, and his name was Vasily Kuznetsov. And hopefully, maybe there's somebody that's better at Russian pronunciation.
Kuznetsov.
Kuznetsov.
You got close.
Yeah.
Kuznetsov. It's funny that he has that name because there was a famous marshal that beat Napoleon that had the name Kuznetsov, and at the end of World War II, Stalin starts naming the operations. One of them was Bagration, which was another marshal against Napoleon, and Kuznetsov was one of the others.
So, Chris, you are now in charge of Russian pronunciation because clearly I'm not very good at it. So, this is a person who had retired and in favor of Gorbachev. And so, but what if he didn't? What if he agreed to be a caretaker for a few years? And in our timeline, he died in 1990. So let's assume that doesn't change. And Gorbachev takes power in 1990. And so you have a very different late 80s in the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1990. What happened? So this Kuznetsov is a clearly a very competent, a very experienced diplomat, and kind of party administrator, party leader, and so he is nobody's fool, and so he will, but he is much more of a hardliner than Gorbachev is.
By the way, where did he study?
In the United States. At Carnegie Mellon.
When I read over it, it reminded me a little bit of Yamamoto.
He's very, a little bit like Yamamoto.
Very much so.
He's
very good comparison.
Both in his education and his orientation, in that, like Yamamoto, he is both very much a hardliner, very much nuanced in his approach to things.
Because he understands the capacity of the United States.
Correct.
In a way that people who, you think a metallurgist who studied at Carnegie Mellon would understand the productive capacity of the United States.
And he does. So I think that is a great place for us to end with that little teaser, and we will pick this back up on a different episode when our friend Mr. Eric Bond, who is now very much involved in his theater production. So he is involved in the last 2 weeks of the Something Rotten rehearsals. So for anybody in the Phoenix area who is looking for something very enjoyable to do, please check that out. Because our friend Eric Bond is a very talented thespian. And so we hope that you will support him and support his colleagues. But we will pick this back up when Eric is available. So
with that, want to plug Slack. For anybody interested, reach out to us there. We do talk there. We welcome ideas. We welcome discussions there. Anything else anybody want to close on?
No, I think this has been great.
Great. All right. Eric, if one should come to a fork in the road, what should they do?
They should probably take it.
All right. Look forward to talking to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.